The tall woman runs barefoot across the gravel, and never once feels it. Behind her, the workshop is burning, and someone bolted the door, from the outside. Midnight in a Wyoming valley. The flames climb high enough, that they can see it, from town, down there in the dark. Nobody calls it in. 2 tire tracks, still wet with oil, pressed into the dirt road, that runs out toward the pines. A plastic can lies tipped on its side at the base of a tree. The cap is still off. Far below, an engine turns over. Then the headlights go out. The dark swallows it whole. Clothes on her face. Ash on her cheek. She doesn't blink. She doesn't cry. She just stares at the place, where the fire finished eating a dead man's chisels. She turns toward the town. And starts walking down the mountain. Millhaven, Wyoming. Population 4,211, though nobody had bothered updating that sign in 11 years. A cold morning in early March, the kind where the mountains still wore snow like a grudge, and the wind coming down off them carried a bite that made old men's knees ache, before they even got out of bed. Dalia Hail walked Main Street the way she walked it every single morning. Head up. Shoulders back. Because that's what her mother taught her, years and years, before cancer took her mother away at a speed that still didn't feel real some mornings. Slouching doesn't make you shorter, baby. It just makes you look ashamed. And ashamed was one thing Dalia refused to be. Not out loud, anyway. Not where anybody could see it land. 6'4" in bare feet. 26 years old. And every single soul in this town had an opinion about both facts, whether she'd asked for one or not. There she goes. A voice drifting off the diner porch. Low. Not low enough. The flagpole. Laughter. 2 women, coffee cups halfway to their mouths, grinning like they'd said something clever. Like nobody had ever called her that before. Flagpole. Giraffe. Beanstalk. She had a mental drawer for each one, filed away and supposedly forgotten. Except they never actually stayed forgotten. That was the lie people told themselves about pain. That it faded with time. It didn't fade. It just went quiet. Waited for a slow morning to climb back out. She kept walking. Didn't break stride. Didn't give them the satisfaction of a flinch. Millhaven had been built by cattlemen and railroad crews back in 1889, and the town had never quite let go of either one. Tradition here wasn't a value people held onto out of love. It was a leash. Everyone on it. Everyone pulling in the same direction, and God help you, if you ever pulled different. The bell above Simmons' hardware jingled, when she pushed through the door. Same bell. Same crooked hook it hung, from since before she was born, probably. 3 years she'd worked this floor, and that bell had never once rung true. Morning, Dalia. Walt Simmons. 56 years old, glasses forever sliding down his nose, a decent man underneath 40 years of small-town armor he'd built up, without ever meaning to. He'd hired her, when nobody else in this town would even grant her an interview. Said her height was good for the top shelves. Joked about it, but not cruelly. Never like the others. Big delivery today, Walt said, flipping through the morning's paperwork. Some fella bought out half our lumber. Whole truckload. Building something up in the hills, from what I hear. Dalia tied her apron. Didn't think much of it. Just another Tuesday in a town that ran out of new things to talk about somewhere around the Clinton administration. She had strong hands. A head for numbers that made Walt's bookkeeping easier than it had any right to be. And customers still did the double take when she hauled 50-pound bags of cement like they weighed nothing at all. Like her own body was some kind of magic trick instead of just a body doing what bodies were built to do. 10 o'clock came. And that's when the shadow hit the front windows. Not a cloud. Not a truck passing by on its way to somewhere else. A man. Dalia looked up from the inventory sheet, and for the first time in longer than she could actually remember, she wasn't the biggest thing in the room. He filled the doorway. Had to duck slightly just to clear the frame. Shoulders built for carrying something considerably heavier than lumber. Black hair pulled back in a braid, streaked here and there, with the kind of gray that comes early to men who've seen things they don't much care to talk about. Worn jeans. Flannel rolled up at the sleeves. A faded canvas jacket, with a small embroidered patch on the left shoulder, that Dalia recognized, without quite placing, the kind veterans wore, not for show, just out of habit, because the jacket still fit, and the memory attached to it never asked permission to leave. And underneath all of it, a stillness. Like he wasn't in any hurry to prove a single thing to anybody in this store. Walt's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "Can I?" He cleared his throat. "Help you?" Silas Tolman. The voice came out low. Resonant. Like it had been carved out of something instead of simply spoken. "Called yesterday. About the lumber order." "Right. Yes." Walt fumbled, through papers he'd already organized twice that morning. That's a lot of wood, Mr. Tolman. Building something big?" Silas didn't answer that. His eyes moved across the store instead. Slow. Taking inventory of more than just tools and fasteners. And then they landed on Dalia. For one full second, neither of them moved. Because she was used to being looked at. Everybody looked at her, one way or another, every single day of her life. What she was never, ever used to was being looked at like this. Not with pity curling underneath it. Not with a joke forming behind the eyes, waiting for the right beat to land. Just looked at. Like a person standing in a room, nothing more complicated than that. "I'll need help loading," Silas said. Still looking at her. "If someone's free." Walt glanced between them, nervous in a way Dalia recognized instantly. The particular nervousness of a man about to say something he'd regret the moment it left his mouth. "Well. Dalia's our strongest, but she's. I can help." She was already moving. Already tightening her gloves instead of untying her apron, because she'd spent 3 years listening to men talk about her like she wasn't standing 3 feet away, and she wasn't about to let today become another one of those days. Silas nodded once. Small. But something lived inside that nod. Approval, maybe. Or recognition. 2 things she wasn't entirely sure she'd ever earned, from a stranger before. 2 hours. That's how long they worked the truck bed together. He didn't make small talk. Didn't ask about her height, her life, the sad little corner booth she claimed at the diner every night out of pure necessity. He just worked. Beside her. Like she was exactly what she was, a person fully capable of lifting a beam, without needing to be rescued, from the effort. When she hoisted a support post, that would have buckled most men's knees, he didn't rush in to take over. Didn't comment. Just matched her pace on the far end, and let the weight settle, where it belonged, the 2 of them moving in a rhythm, that felt, somehow, already practiced. "Building something big," she said finally, breaking her own silence somewhere around the last row of joists. "A house. Simple. Final. For your family?" He was quiet a long moment. Long enough that she started wondering if she'd asked something wrong. "For someone," he said, "who deserves better than what she's been given." Before she could ask what that meant, who that meant, because her mind had already started circling the question like a moth around a porch light, he was climbing back, into the truck. Engine turning over. Gravel crunching under those enormous tires. And she stood there. In the parking lot. holding more questions than she'd walked in with that morning. Word moves fast in a town this small. Faster, most days, than truth ever manages to. By closing time, half of Millhaven had already built a theory around the giant, who bought a truckload of lumber, and said nothing at all about why. By dinner, those theories had grown teeth. The diner was packed that night. Which meant Dalia's corner booth, the only one in the whole place, where her legs actually fit, without folding sideways, sat at the exact epicenter of every whispered rumor, within a 5-mile radius. "I heard he's hiding from something," Betty Crawford said, loud enough to carry clear across the room. Betty always said things loud enough to carry. That was, essentially, the whole point of Betty. Some kind of criminal. Building himself a bunker up there, probably. That's nonsense. Doc Whitfield. 70-something, spine like a fence post, the only man in this town who delivered half the babies currently mocking people twice his patience. His people were here, before any of ours ever thought to show up. Man's got every right in the world. Nobody argued with document. Not directly, anyway. But the room didn't exactly agree with him either. Dalia picked at her meatloaf. Kept her eyes down. Because eyes down meant nobody caught yours, and nobody catching yours meant nobody found an opening to work through. Didn't work tonight. Speaking of giants. Martha Henderson's voice sliced clean, through the diner chatter. Maybe our resident flagpole finally found herself a match. Laughter. Sharp. Coordinated, almost, like they'd rehearsed the cruelty, over years of unbroken practice. Which, they had. That was exactly what they'd done, night after night, for as long as she could remember sitting in this booth. Dalia's face burned. She didn't look up. Didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Finished her plate in silence, because leaving hungry always felt like losing twice over. Walking out, the diner went quiet behind her. It always did. Like her exit was the single interesting event of the whole evening, and the silence itself was just another kind of comment. Outside. Cold air. Pine smell drifting down off the mountains, sharp enough to clear her head a little. She walked home slow, past the bookstore, up the narrow stairs to the apartment Walt had specially modified for her, ceilings raised 8 inches, doorframes widened, because even her landlord had understood, somewhere along the way, what half this town refused to. She lay in bed, that night thinking about a man who'd looked at her like she was simply a person. Not a punchline. Not a problem somebody needed to manage. Not a curiosity to be catalogued, and discussed at the diner over meatloaf. She didn't know, lying there in the dark listening to the wind push against her window, that his name would eventually come to mean everything. The next morning brought chaos to Simmons Hardware, before Dalia even had her jacket off. That Apache fella, Walt's hands were already shaking slightly, the way they did, when gossip made him more anxious than angry. He's caused a mess. What kind of mess? Mayor Grayson sent the city inspector up there first thing. No permits filed. Ordered him to stop construction. Effective immediately. Dalia felt something twist low in her stomach. He just bought all that lumber yesterday. That's not even the worst part. Walt set the paper down like it might bite him. Grayson's calling a town meeting tonight. Says we can't have outsiders coming in here doing whatever they please. Outsiders. She knew exactly what that word was doing. Knew it the way you know a wound is about to reopen, before it even starts to bleed again. The day dragged on and on. Every customer had questions. Nobody had actual answers. And underneath every single question ran, that same ugly current, the one that didn't need to be spoken out loud to be perfectly understood by everyone standing near it. Don't care if his people were here first, she overheard Bob Patterson tell his buddy near the paint counter. This is our town now. We got rules. Our town. Our rules. Who exactly got to decide that? Dalia had lived here her entire life, and never once, not for a single day, felt like this town actually belonged to her either. By closing, she'd made a decision that would have shocked absolutely anyone who actually knew her. She wasn't a woman who picked fights. She kept her head down. Avoided conflict the way other people avoided debt collectors. But something about a stranger being run out of town simply for the crime of being different, that hit somewhere inside her she couldn't manage to ignore. Somewhere entirely too close to home to pretend wasn't hers to defend. The community center was packed by 7 folding chairs scraping against concrete. Coffee urns steaming uselessly in the corner nobody would touch, because nobody had ever trusted the coffee at these things, and probably never would. Mayor Russell Grayson stood at the front. Older than his voice let on, silver hair combed carefully, over a scalp that had started thinning years back, the kind of man who'd been mayor so long the town forgot to ask whether they still wanted him. A voice built for a much bigger room than his actual authority deserved. "We can't have people coming into our community," he was saying, "ignoring our laws. Property values. Safety concerns. The character of this neighborhood. All of it's at stake here, folks, whether you want to hear it tonight or not." Dalia slid in through the back door. Found a seat that wasn't really built for her, the way none of them ever were. Heads turned. They always did. Curious. Hostile. Somewhere uncomfortably in between. What's he even building that's got everyone so worked up? Mrs. Patterson called out from the middle rows. That's just it. Grayson's smile was thin as paper. Nobody knows. Won't say. Refuses to file for permits. For all we know it could be some kind of compound. An illegal operation. We simply don't know what we're dealing with. Murmurs. Agreement, mostly. The specific kind of agreement that comes easy to people who want permission to be afraid of something they haven't actually bothered to understand. Dalia felt her jaw tighten. She'd seen that lumber with her own 2 hands. Residential grade. Nothing remotely sinister about a stack of 2x4s and roofing joists. Nothing except who exactly was buying it. "Maybe," she said, and her own voice surprised her by how clearly it carried, "we should just ask him." Every head in the room turned at once. Grayson's face reddened. "Miss Hale. I don't think you understand the complexity of the situation. I understand you're making assumptions about a man you've never once spoken to." She stood. Full height. No apology folded into it. "And I understand this town has a long, ugly history of being unwelcoming to anyone who's different." Silence. The kind that has actual weight to it. Everyone in that room knew exactly what she meant. Knew the years. The names. The corner booth nobody else ever fought her for. Nobody said any of it out loud. Nobody had to. "This isn't about being different," Grayson said. "This is about the law. Then help him file the paperwork. Instead of trying to run him out." The door opened. And every conversation in that room died at once, all together, like somebody had cut the power. Silas Tolman walked down the center aisle like he owned the ground beneath it. Which, technically, legally, in a way nobody in that room understood, yet, he very well might have. He stopped at the front. Turned. Faced the crowd, without a trace of hesitation in him. "Heard you've been discussing me." Grayson cleared his throat. "Twice. Mr. Tolman. We were simply expressing some concerns about the building project." "What concerns?" "The permits, for one. And the fact nobody knows what you're building." Silas was quiet. Let the silence stretch, until it turned uncomfortable, until it became its own kind of statement all by itself. His eyes moved slowly across the room. Found Dalia in the back row. Something passed between them. She felt it land somewhere behind her ribs, quiet and unannounced. "I'm building a house," Silas said, finally. "For someone who's been treated poorly by this community for far too long." The room erupted into whispers. Speculation. Heads turning, one by one, toward the back row. Toward her. Dalia's face burned hotter than it had at the diner. Hotter than every single whisper she'd absorbed across 26 years combined, into one moment. "As for the permits," Silas continued, "I'll get whatever paperwork you require. But understand something. I'm not going anywhere. And neither is my project." He walked back down the aisle. Stopped at her row. "Would you like to see what I'm building?" She nodded. Because her voice wasn't cooperating with her at that particular moment, and nodding was the only thing left that still worked. They left together. Behind them, a room full of people, who suddenly had a great deal more to whisper about than they'd walked in with. The drive took them up, into the foothills, along dirt roads carved by nothing but decades of steady use. Silas's truck was big enough that for once, for the very first time she could remember in her adult life, her knees didn't hit the dashboard. Small thing. Felt enormous. "How long have you lived in Millhaven?" he asked. "All my life. 26 years of being the town joke." "You're not a joke." 4 words. No decoration wrapped around them anywhere. And somehow they landed harder than any speech anyone had ever given her. "What made you decide to build here?" she asked. Silence again. The kind he seemed entirely comfortable inside of, the way most people were only ever comfortable inside noise. "My grandmother used to tell a story," he said eventually. "About a tall woman, who came to teach on the reservation back in the 40s. White folks thought she was strange, on account of her height. Our people didn't much care. Treated her with the same dignity they'd treat anyone at all. What happened to her? Married one of our men. Lived there the rest of her life. Grandmother always said she was the happiest woman she ever knew. Because she finally found a place where being different wasn't something a person had to survive." Dalia's throat tightened. She looked out the window at the dark shapes of pine sliding past, and said nothing, because there was nothing left that wouldn't have cracked her voice clean in half. "You served," she said quietly, nodding toward the small patch on his jacket sleeve. "Didn't you?" He glanced down at it, like he'd almost forgotten it was there. 2 tours. Army. Long time ago now." A pause, careful. "Came back different than I left. Most men do." "Different how?" "Quieter." He kept his eyes on the road. "Learned pretty fast that most of what people argue over doesn't amount to much once you've seen what actually matters." Another pause, this one heavier. "Learned to build things instead. Building doesn't lie to you the way people sometimes do." She didn't push further. Understood, somehow, without needing it explained, that she'd already been handed more than most people in this town had ever earned from him. They reached the property in full dark, moonlight doing the work streetlights couldn't manage out here. And she gasped. Because even in silhouette, the frame rising out of that clearing was something else entirely. Not just big. Deliberate. Every beam set, with a kind of care that spoke louder than any blueprint ever could. "You're building this yourself," she said. "With my hands. The way my father taught me. The way his father taught him before that." They walked the site together. He explained it, as they went, ceilings raised high enough that neither of them would ever have to duck beneath a doorframe again, a kitchen built for someone who actually stood tall enough to use the counters, without bending her spine in half just to reach a cutting board. "It's beautiful," she said. And meant it completely. "But Silas. Who's it for?" He stopped walking. turned to face her fully, moonlight catching the plane of his jaw, the stillness sitting deep in his eyes. "For you," he said. "Dalia Hail. If you'll have it." The ground tilted sideways beneath her, gently, like the whole clearing had shifted an inch to the left. "I don't understand," she whispered. He stepped closer. His shadow didn't feel threatening at all. It felt like shelter. Which confused her even more than the offer itself had. "I've been watching you," he said. "Not in a strange way. I've seen how this town treats you. How they manage to make you feel small, despite everything about you being the exact opposite of small." Her arms wrapped around herself, without permission from the rest of her body. "You don't even know me. I know enough." His voice carried something absolute inside it. "I know you work harder than anyone in that hardware store. I know you're kind to the kids who stare at you in the grocery aisle, instead of getting angry back at them. I know you eat alone in that corner booth, because it's the only place your legs actually fit. And I know you pretend not to hear when they call you names. I hear it too. Every time." Tears stung before she could stop them. Because someone had noticed. Actually noticed. The small, humiliating architecture of her daily life, and instead of looking away from it, he'd built something in direct response to it. "Why would you do this?" she asked, "for a stranger?" He was quiet a long moment. Looking past her, toward the frame of the house, like the answer lived somewhere inside the wood itself, waiting to be measured and cut. "My wife," he said finally. "Died 3 years ago. Cancer." Dalia stopped breathing for a second. "She was small," he continued. "Barely 5 feet. Biggest heart I've ever known in a person that size. Before she passed, she made me promise her something." He paused. Let it settle into the cold night air between them. "Said if I ever found somebody hurting the way I hurt, as a boy, somebody rejected for being different, I owed it to help them, if I could. Said loneliness was the cruelest thing a person could carry through a life. And people who understand that kind of pain," she said, "have a responsibility to each other. You were rejected. For being different." A sad smile crossed his face. "Barely there. Gone almost as fast as it had arrived. 7-foot Apache men don't exactly blend in anywhere, Dalia. Not on the reservation. Not off it. Spent most of my boyhood being stared at like some kind of curiosity. Difference is," he looked at her directly now, steady. "I found someone who loved me exactly the way I was. You haven't had that chance yet." The words hung there between them. Heavier than anything either of them was quite ready to lift off the ground. "This is insane," she said finally, stepping back half a step, needing the distance just to think straight. "You can't just build someone a house, because you feel sorry for them. I don't feel sorry for you." His voice hardened, just slightly. Just enough to mean it. "I respect you. There's a difference. A big one." Weeks passed. Millhaven kept talking, the way small towns always keep talking, long after the thing they're talking about stops being news, and starts turning into habit. Grayson had obtained the permits, with unusual speed, which only fed the gossip fire hotter than before. Wasn't right, people muttered over their coffee. Wasn't natural, a man moving that fast through paperwork, that took everyone else months of waiting. Dalia hadn't seen Silas since that night on the mountain. His absence sat in her chest like a held breath she couldn't quite manage to release. She'd replayed the conversation 100 times over. A man she barely knew had essentially proposed building her an entire life, and she'd retreated from it like something startled out of the brush. "You're distracted," Walt said one afternoon, watching her miscount the same inventory sheet for the 3rd time in an hour. "I'm fine." Walt studied her the way a man studies something he already understands, but wants confirmed out loud anyway. In 3 years, I've never once seen you look at anybody the way you looked at that man. That's not. Means maybe you oughta stop running from something that could actually be good for you. The bell above the door jingled, before she could answer him. Silas walked in. Same quiet weight to his steps. But something different in him today. A kind of resolve, that seemed to charge the whole air around him. Dalia. No preamble. We need to talk. Walt suddenly discovered urgent business in the back room. Left them alone among the paint cans and fastener bins. I know you're scared, Silas said. And I know the whole thing feels impossible. But I need you to understand something. I'm not going away. Silas, you can't just build a house for a woman you barely know. He almost smiled at that. The expression transformed his whole face when it landed. Been thinking about that. You're right. It is crazy. A pause. So let me offer you something else instead. She waited. Heart doing something complicated behind her ribs. Come work for me. I need help with the construction. You're the strongest person I know, and that's not flattery, that's just fact. He held her eyes steady. We'll spend time together. Get to know each other properly. If, once the house is finished, you want nothing to do with me, I'll sell it. Move on. But give us the chance to find out what this could be, first. The offer was so unexpectedly reasonable that she found herself nodding before she'd even finished processing it. I'll need to give Walt notice. Take your time. 2 weeks. His smile widened, and for the first time, since she was maybe 9 years old, Dalia felt like someone was genuinely glad to have her around. Not despite anything about her. Because of everything. 2 weeks. That's all it took for Millhaven to show her exactly who this town really was underneath its own polite surface. Word spread that Dalia Hail was leaving Simmons Hardware to work for the Apache giant, and the gossip mill didn't just turn, it caught fire. Always knew she was strange, Martha Henderson told anyone who'd listen. But taking up with that, she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Everyone understood the shape of exactly what she'd left hanging there in the air. The undertone that had lurked beneath every joke, every whisper, every sideways glance for 26 years, it finally came up for air. Fully formed. Unashamed of itself for the first time in Dalia's memory. Somebody left a note on her windshield. One word. Traitor. Somebody spray-painted a slur across the side of the bookstore below her apartment. And on her last day at Simmons Hardware, locking up alone in the fading light, 4 men were waiting for her by the truck bay. Cole Grayson led them. Mayor's son. 23, built like he'd never done a physical day's work in his life, mouth built for exactly the kind of thing he was about to say. You sure you know what you're doing, Dalia? His voice dripped with something that wanted to pass for concern, and wasn't fooling anyone standing near it. That Indian's got you all turned around, doesn't he? My personal life, she said, keeping her voice level, isn't your business, Cole. See, that's where you're wrong. He stepped closer. She caught the alcohol on his breath, from 3 feet away. Small town. What affects one of us affects all of us. And having our women taken by outsiders, well. That affects everybody. I'm not your woman. Her voice didn't shake. Surprised even her, saying it. I'm not anybody's woman. Something ugly crossed his face. That's right. You're not. You're a freak, so desperate for attention you'll spread your legs for the first savage, who shows you any. The slap landed, before he even saw her arm move. Crack. Loud enough to bounce clean off the storefront glass behind him. His friend stepped back, stunned by the sudden violence, stunned that violence had a woman's hand attached to it this time. Don't you ever, Dalia said, voice gone flat, and quiet and dangerous in a way she'd never once heard from herself before. Speak to me like that again. And if I hear you've been spreading lies about him, or about me, I'll do a great deal more than slap you." She walked away. Legs shaking with adrenaline, she refused to let show in her stride. Behind her, Cole cursed, and his friends worked to calm him down, and none of it mattered to her anymore. She'd made an enemy tonight. She found, walking to her car in the dark, that she genuinely did not care. The cabin sat lower on the property than the main house, tucked against a stand of pine, small but immaculate. Stone fireplace. Windows that looked out, over a valley, that seemed to stretch clear, into next week. Silas had put in work here. Fresh flowers on the table. Food already stocked in the refrigerator. Towels folded in the bathroom like he'd rehearsed the gesture a dozen times, before she'd ever arrived. "This is beautiful," she said, standing in the doorway, with her single duffel bag still slung over her shoulder. "Belonged to my grandfather." He watched her take it in. "Been fixing it up. Ceilings are a little low for you, I'm afraid." "It's perfect." She meant it more than the words alone could carry. "First place I've ever lived, where somebody actually thought about what I might need." They spent that first full day working the frame together. Silas taught patiently, how to read the plans, how to set a level line, how to trust the wood instead of fighting it every step of the way. She discovered, to her own surprise, that her hands understood construction in a way they'd never once understood the front counter at the hardware store. "Good hands," Silas said, watching her measure, and cut a length of trim, with a precision that surprised them both. "Good eye, too. Always liked building things, as a kid," she admitted. Nobody ever thought to encourage it. Days folded into a rhythm. Sunrise to sawdust. Lunch under the shade of an old pine, that had probably watched this whole valley change more than either of them ever would in their lifetimes. Work until the light thinned out toward dusk. Evenings on the cabin porch, talking about nothing, and everything while the stars came out, over Millhaven, small and distant enough down there, that it almost looked harmless, from up here. She learned about his wife. Maria. A teacher. 15 years married, no children, a source of quiet grief he carried, without ever performing it for anyone's benefit. She always said we were meant to help other people's children instead, he told her one evening, voice low. Maybe she was right about that. You would have made a good father. Maybe. He looked at her sideways. What about you? Ever want children? She was quiet a long time before answering. Used to dream about it. Then I started thinking what it'd be like for a kid to have a mother built like me. The stares. The questions. Seemed cruel to hand a child that kind of inheritance. Children adapt, Silas said gently. And they love without conditions. Might be worth considering, someday. The house grew. Beam by beam, and so did they, not with declarations or grand gestures, but with shared labor and quiet honesty, the two of them understanding each other in ways that went well past words alone. It was a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into the work, when Dalia walked into the equipment shed looking for a level, and instead found herself standing frozen in the doorway. Silas was on the phone outside, pacing near the truck. Not her business, normally. Except the voice on the other end carried far enough on the wind, that she caught pieces of it, before she could stop herself from listening. Not Silas's voice. Mayor Grayson's. Which made no sense at all, until it started making a different, uglier kind of sense entirely. Not asking you, Frank, I'm telling you. That file from 62 needs to disappear, before anybody starts digging. You understand what happens to this town, to my seat, if that land survey ever sees daylight. Dalia's stomach dropped straight through the floorboards. She stood there, level still in her hand, not breathing, not moving, every instinct screaming at her to step back, before she was seen listening to something she clearly wasn't meant to hear. Because that wasn't about permits. That wasn't about lumber, or zoning, or any of the small, petty reasons Millhaven had been throwing at Silas Tolman, since the day he first walked into Simmons Hardware. That was something else entirely. Something old. Something buried on purpose, and somebody, the mayor of this town, the man who stood at every podium talking about laws and community standards, was working very hard right now to keep it exactly where it was. She backed out of the shed slow. Careful. Heart hammering loud enough she was half convinced it could be heard clear across the valley. Whatever that file was. Whatever happened back in 1962. It was the real reason this town had turned itself inside out, over one man building one house on one piece of mountain. And she had absolutely no idea, standing there in the fading light, with her hands shaking around a level she no longer remembered picking up, just how deep this particular hole went. Or how far down it was about to pull all of them. The days stopped being days, and started being something else entirely. A rhythm. A heartbeat shared between two people who'd both spent years learning to live smaller than they were ever actually built to live. Dalia woke before the sun now. Because sleeping in felt like wasting something she didn't used to have any of. Which was time, that actually belonged to her, fully, without anyone else's opinion attached to it. She'd make coffee in the cabin's small kitchen, the one Silas had lowered the shelves in just for her, and she'd watch the light change, over the valley, and some mornings she'd just stand there. Not doing anything at all. Just breathing air, that didn't have anybody's laughter folded into it. Until the day everything shifted again. The way it kept shifting on this mountain, whether anyone up here asked for it to. A truck came rattling up the dirt road just past 9. Old. Dented. The kind of vehicle that had clearly survived more winters than the person driving it probably deserved credit for. Silas came out of the workshop wiping sawdust off his hands, and his whole face changed. Softened. Which she'd never once seen happen before. Not for anyone. Grandmother, he said, and the word came out different than any other word she'd heard him say. Lighter. Like it cost him absolutely nothing to carry. The woman who climbed down from that truck was small. Impossibly small, next to her grandson. Silver hair braided down her back, skin like something carved slowly out of patience itself. But she moved like the mountain belonged to her personally. Because it probably did, in ways deeper than any deed had ever bothered to record. I came to meet your woman, Nora Tolman said, in English carrying the weight of another language sitting quietly underneath it. And to see this house everyone's been talking about. Dalia felt her stomach drop straight to her boots. Because this was it. The moment she'd been dreading, since the night Silas first said the word marriage, without actually saying it out loud. The moment where somebody, who mattered, somebody, whose opinion Silas actually needed, looked at her, and decided, right there on the spot, whether she belonged in this family or not. She stood there. Tried not to hunch. Tried not to make herself smaller, the way 26 years of hard practice kept whispering she probably should. Nora's eyes moved over her. Slow. Unhurried. Cataloging something Dalia couldn't quite read, from the outside. You're very tall, Nora said finally. Yes, ma'am. I am. Good. A small nod. Final, like a door closing shut on any other possible outcome. Silas needs a woman, who can look him in the eye. And that was it. That was the whole verdict. 6 words, and Dalia felt something crack open in her chest, that had been sealed shut, since she was maybe 9 years old. Because nobody had ever, not once in her entire life, framed her height, as the very thing, that made her right for something. Only ever the thing that made her wrong. She showed Nora the house that afternoon. Every room. Every detail Silas had built, with his own 2 hands, patient and exact. Nora ran her palm along a doorframe like she was reading Braille off the wood grain. "This is good work," she said. "But it's more than a house, isn't it?" "What do you mean?" "It's a declaration." Nora's dark eyes found hers. "That you exist. That you deserve space in this world same as anyone else walking around in it." Dalia's throat tightened, so fast she had to look away. "I never thought of it that way. Buildings are always statements." Nora kept walking, kept touching things like she was blessing each one in turn. "The question is whether they're statements made out of fear. Or statements made out of hope." A pause at the threshold of the bedroom, sunlight falling across the floorboards Silas had sanded entirely by hand. "This one is hope." That night, around a fire pit Silas had built, from stones he'd hauled up, from the creek bed himself, Nora told stories. About the reservation. About a grandmother, who raised Silas, after his parents died in a car accident on a highway, that still didn't have proper guardrails, all these years later. About traditions passed hand to hand like something too precious to ever trust to paper alone. "Love doesn't always look the way people expect it to," Nora said, firelight carving deep lines into her face. "Sometimes it grows slow. Sometimes it hits like lightning splitting a tree clean in half." She looked at Silas. "Is that what you had, with your grandfather?" Nora's smile went soft in a way that made her look decades younger for just a moment. "Your grandfather was a giant too. 7'3", in his bare feet. People stared when we walked through town together. The giant Apache man and his tiny wife. A dry laugh, worn smooth by time. We didn't care. We knew exactly what we had." "What did you have?" Dalia asked. Quiet. Because she genuinely wanted to know the answer. "Everything that mattered." Nora counted it off like beads sliding along a string. Trust. Respect. Shared purpose. The ability to make each other laugh even when the whole world outside wasn't laughing along with us. She looked directly at Dalia now, steady. And the knowledge that we were stronger together than we ever could have been apart. Dalia didn't sleep much that night. Not because anything was wrong. Because for the first time in her whole life, something felt exactly right, and she didn't yet know what to do with a feeling like that except lie awake and hold on to it. The proposal came 3 days later. In the sawdust. On his knees. No ring bent into some jeweler's velvet box, no rehearsed speech memorized in advance. Just Silas, kneeling in the framework of the house he'd built, his enormous hands wrapped carefully around hers. "I love you," he said. Simple. Absolute. Not because you're tall. Not because I feel sorry for you. Not because you're convenient, or available, or the first woman who ever looked past what my size does to a room the second I walk into it. He held her eyes steady. "I love you, because you're strong, and brave, and kind in a way this town never once deserved from you. I love the way you concentrate, when you're working. I love that you slapped Cole Grayson across the face, and didn't apologize for it once." A wet laugh broke out of her, before she could stop it. "I love that you trust me enough," he continued, "to let me build you a home." A breath. "Will you marry me, Dalia Hail?" "Yes." The word came out, before her brain had even finished processing the question. "Yes. I'll marry you." When he kissed her, it was the first time in her life anyone had ever had to bend down to reach her lips. And in that moment, surrounded by a house built entirely from the intention of loving her exactly as she was, Dalia finally understood what it felt like to come home. Word of the engagement reached Millhaven inside 24 hours. Because that's simply how this town operated. Faster than fire. Meaner, too, most days of the week. The division split clean down the middle. On one side, a small handful, who thought it was something like a fairy tale finally landing in the right zip code for once. On the other, considerably larger, considerably louder, a chorus, that saw betrayal instead. Betrayal of tradition. Of blood. Of whatever invisible line this town had drawn around itself generations back, and never once bothered questioning since. Doc Whitfield offered his congratulations the moment Dalia came down the mountain for supplies. Loud enough that the whole general store could hear every word of it. "About time somebody recognized what a treasure you are," he said, weathered face breaking, into a grin that reached all the way up to his eyes. But Doc's approval got drowned out fast by everything else waiting for her in town. At the grocery, the cashier wouldn't meet her eyes, while ringing up her order. At the pharmacy, the man behind the counter claimed to be out of her regular prescription, except she could see the bottles lined up on the shelf directly behind his shoulder, plain as anything. And at Simmons Hardware, where she'd spent 3 years of her life, Walt could barely bring himself to look at her at all. "I'm disappointed in you," he said quietly, tallying her purchase, without meeting her eyes once. "Disappointed." She set her jaw. "And then what, Walt?" "Disappointed I'm happy?" His face reddened. "Disappointed you'd throw your life away on someone who's using you." "Using me for what?" He didn't answer right away. Which told her everything she needed to know about how thin his own reasoning actually was, underneath all of it. "Think about it," he finally said, leaning across the counter. "Shows up out of nowhere. Finds the loneliest woman in town. Suddenly he's building her a house." A pause. "Men like that don't do things, without expecting something in return." "Men like what, Walt?" Her voice dropped low. "Dangerous." He had the decency to look ashamed. Almost. Not quite enough to actually stop talking. "You know what I mean." She placed her money on the counter. Picked up her bag. "The only person in this conversation, who doesn't share my values," she said, "is you." She walked out. Didn't look back once, though behind her she heard him mutter something about ungrateful, about making her own bed, and lying in it. Some bridges, once burned, aren't worth the effort of rebuilding. She was learning that lesson fast, this last month. Learning it over, and over, in different rooms, from different mouths, and somehow it still stung fresh every single time it happened. They set the wedding date 3 weeks out. Right there in the house, once the last of the trim work was finished. A small guest list. Quality over quantity, Dalia joked, though underneath the joke sat a harder truth. Quantity had never once been offered to her, so quality was the only option she'd ever actually had a chance to build. Nora returned 2 weeks before the ceremony. This time with company. Silas's cousin, a young man named Dell. A tribal elder named Victor Saltwood, spine straight as a rifle barrel despite his 80-some years on this earth. And a woman named Ruth Featherstone, who carried herself like someone who'd spent a whole lifetime holding other people's grief steady on their behalf. They came to witness. And, as Nora explained it, to formally welcome Dalia into a family that had never once asked her to shrink herself to fit inside it. The ceremony took place in the living room of the finished house. Traditional Apache elements woven together, with vows Silas had written himself, spoken half in English, half in a language Dalia didn't understand, but felt anyway, in the cadence of it, in the weight Silas gave every single syllable. When it came her turn to speak, she looked around the small room at the handful of people who'd somehow become her family faster than 26 years of blood relations ever had managed to. "I spent my whole life," she said, voice steady despite everything shaking underneath it, "trying to make myself smaller. Trying to take up less space. To apologize for existing." She turned to Silas. "But he didn't ask me to be smaller. He built me a house, with rooms that finally fit. He made furniture that fits my body instead of mocking it. He saw me exactly as I am, and decided I was worth building a life around." Tears now, unstoppable, streaming freely down her face. I promise to never make myself smaller for anyone. Ever again. The blessing that followed came in the old language, Ruth calling on something ancient and directional, something that had nothing to do with the county records office, and everything to do with a kind of belonging that predated every fence line Millhaven had ever bothered drawing. When it ended, Nora stepped forward with a gift. A quilt, hand-stitched in a traditional pattern, but sized generously enough for a bed built to hold two very tall people comfortably. Every marriage needs a strong foundation, Nora said, pressing it into Dalia's arms. This will keep you warm through the cold nights. And remind you of the love that brought you here. For 1 full hour, standing on that porch, surrounded by people who'd chosen her, without a single condition attached, Dalia felt something close to complete. That hour didn't last. The first sound was engines. Distant. Then closer. Silas's whole body tensed the way it did, before a storm broke, before he'd even fully registered why his instincts had already sounded the alarm. Dell's hand moved toward his waistband on pure reflex alone. Expecting more guests, he asked, low. No, Silas said. And Dalia watched something harden across his face, that she'd never once seen sit there before. Because the lead vehicle coming up that mountain road was the mayor's official car. And behind it, she counted, without meaning to, 6 more. Trucks and sedans, kicking dust into the evening light, a small convoy, that had no business being anywhere near a wedding they hadn't been invited to attend. I'm not hiding, Dalia said, already moving toward the porch railing. This is our home. Today is our wedding day. If they came to cause trouble, they can do it in front of witnesses. Nora stepped up beside her. Small. Formidable in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with size. Apache women don't run from fights, she said quietly. Especially not in their own home. The vehicles stopped in a rough half-circle at the edge of the property. Doors opened. And out stepped a crowd that looked less like law enforcement, and more like a poorly organized militia, righteous indignation plastered thick across every face in it. Mayor Russell Grayson led them. Behind him, Cole. Behind Cole, a handful of familiar faces, from the diner. Martha Henderson. Bob Patterson. And Walt Simmons, trailing at the very back, looking like a man who'd rather be standing anywhere else on this earth. Silas Tolman. Grayson's voice tried for an authority it couldn't quite hold up under its own weight. We need a word with you. Silas stepped forward. Placed himself squarely between his family and the men climbing his mountain uninvited. This is private property, Mayor. Flat. Final. You're not welcome here. Now see here. Grayson pulled a folded document from his jacket, waving it around like it settled anything at all. I've got a cease and desist. Ordering you to halt all construction on this property, effective immediately. Nora let out a sound that might have been laughter. Dry. Ancient. White man's papers, she said, loud enough to carry across the whole clearing, on Apache land. Some things never change, no matter how many years pass. Dell stepped up beside his cousin. Quiet menace radiating off him, without a single wasted movement. What's the real reason you're here, Mayor? Because that paper's not worth the ink it's printed with if this is tribal land. Grayson's face reddened. This is American soil. American laws apply. Actually. Victor Saltwood spoke for the first time, and something in his voice made the whole crowd go still all at once. This particular parcel was never properly ceded. Not in any treaty this country ever signed. It belongs to the Apache Nation by right of prior occupation. Has, this whole time, whether anyone in this county bothered checking or not. The revelation sent a visible ripple through the crowd from Millhaven. Because they'd come up this mountain expecting to intimidate two people, with paperwork and small-town muscle. Not to run headfirst into a tribal elder, who understood federal Indian law considerably better than any of them understood their own zoning code. "That's impossible," Walt blurted, stepping forward before he could stop himself. "This land's been in white hands, over a century now." "Stolen doesn't mean owned," Ruth said, quiet as a blade sliding free of its sheath. "And stolen land can always be reclaimed." Cole pushed forward now. Emboldened by his father's presence, or maybe just by whatever he'd been drinking on the drive up. "You people think you can waltz in here, and just take whatever you want. This is still America. We still have rights." "What rights would those be?" Dalia stepped out, from behind Silas despite his hand reaching for her arm to hold her back. "The right to harass people on their wedding day? The right to trespass? The right to be racist bullies? Don't you dare lecture us." Cole's voice cracked, with something ugly underneath it. "You threw away any right to our respect, when you betrayed your own kind." The words hit the air like a dropped glass. Everyone waited to see if she'd shatter along with it. "My own kind." Her voice carried clear across the whole property, steady, unshaken. "You mean tall people? Because I never met another group I belonged to until now." She gestured toward Nora, toward Dell, toward Victor and Ruth. "These people welcomed me, without a single condition attached. Didn't ask me to change one solitary thing about myself." A pause. "If that's betraying my own kind, then I'm proud to be called a traitor." Nora nodded, slow and satisfied, while several of the Millhaven contingent shifted their weight, suddenly uncomfortable in their own boots. Because not everyone up here had actually come with malice. Some had simply followed the crowd, the way crowds always find their followers eventually, and Dalia's words were starting to work like a splinter under their skin. Grayson, sensing his support wobbling underneath him, played the card he'd clearly been saving for this exact moment. "There's another matter." His voice dropped, aiming for a gravity it hadn't actually earned. "We've had reports. Illegal activity on this property. Possible weapons stockpiling. Some kind of compound being built up here." The accusation was so absurd Silas actually laughed. Short. Humorless. "Drug manufacturing with what equipment?" "Weapons stockpiling. Search the place right now, if you want. You'll find construction tools. A beat. And wedding cake." "We're not talking about what's here now," Grayson pressed. "We're talking about what you're planning. Everyone knows your people have a history." He didn't finish the sentence. Dell had already closed the distance between them, and something in his stillness said more than any shout ever could have. "My people," Dell said, voice gone dangerously quiet, "have a history of defending ourselves. Against exactly this. People showing up, with papers, and lies, claiming the right to tell us how to live our own lives." "Is that a threat?" Cole demanded, trying for brave, and landing somewhere considerably closer to scared. "I don't make threats." Dell held his gaze steady. "I make promises. And I'm promising you, if you don't leave this property right now, you're about to find out exactly what hospitality looks like once it's finally been pushed too far." The standoff might have gone somewhere ugly, somewhere none of them could have walked back from afterward. Except headlights swept across the clearing. Another vehicle, climbing the mountain road, slower than the convoy that came before it. Doc Whitfield's ancient pickup rolled to a stop, engine coughing like it always did, and behind it two more cars, headlights cutting clean, through the dusk. Doc climbed out slow, joints protesting every single step, and took in the scene, with the kind of calm only decades of delivering bad news to frightened families could ever earn a man. "Russell." He caught himself, cleared his throat, started again. "What in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing?" Grayson looked flustered by the interruption. "Doc, this doesn't concern you." Concerns me plenty, when half my patients are acting like damn fools on a mountainside. Doc walked straight past the mayor, ignoring him entirely, and pressed a small wrapped package into Dalia's hands. Congratulations on your wedding. Brought you a gift. Behind him, doors opened on the other two vehicles. An elderly gas station owner Dalia recognized, from a lifetime of small errands run around this town. And, unexpectedly, Jenny from the grocery counter, the same woman who'd refused to meet her eyes just 2 weeks earlier. Heard there might be trouble, the old man said. Figured you might need friends. The arrival shifted everything. Suddenly the Millhaven contingent found themselves outnumbered by people they had to live and work alongside every single day of their lives, people whose good opinion actually mattered to their daily existence in ways political theater simply never could. This is ridiculous. Grayson's voice climbed toward panic now. We're trying to protect this community, and you're taking their side. I'm taking the side of decent people, Doc said flatly. Something you might try sometime, Russell. Jenny stepped forward, still refusing to meet Dalia's eyes, but forcing the words out anyway. I wanted to apologize. For how I've been acting. Wasn't right of me, none of it. The small gesture did more damage to the crowd's resolve than any legal argument possibly could have. People began muttering among themselves. A few started drifting back toward their trucks, the fight draining out of them now that the numbers had finally evened out. Walt wasn't ready to let it go, though. This isn't over, he said, jabbing a finger toward Silas. You can't just come into our town and turn everything upside down. I didn't come to your town. Silas's voice stayed level, unbothered by any of it. I came to my land. There's a difference. We'll see about that. Walt's voice cracked on the way out. Courts. Lawyers. Whatever it takes to settle this. And Walt. Doc's voice carried the particular authority of a man who delivered half this town into the world, Walt included, decades back. Go home. You're embarrassing yourself in front of people who know better. That did it. One by one, the Millhaven crowd folded back into their vehicles, muttering complaints nobody bothered finishing out loud. Cole was the last to go, pausing at the edge of the clearing to fire off one final shot in Dalia's direction. This isn't over, he said. You'll regret choosing them over us. The convoy disappeared down the mountain road, taillights swallowed whole by the dark, and for a long moment nobody left standing on that porch said anything at all. I'm sorry that happened, Doc finally offered to Nora. Not everyone in this town is like that. Nora studied him a moment. You're the doctor who delivered Silas. On the reservation. Doc looked surprised she remembered something, that far back. You recall that? I remember everything. A small, weathered smile. You drove through a blizzard for a woman you'd never met. Because it was the right thing to do. A pause. Some things don't ever change, no matter how many years try to bury them. The rest of that evening softened into something Dalia hadn't expected at all going into it. An unlikely mix of Apache family and sympathetic Millhaven neighbors, finding common ground in their shared refusal to let fear win the night after everything. Jenny insisted on helping set out the food Nora had prepared, moving through the small crowd like she was trying to earn back something she'd lost weeks ago, and hadn't fully realized, until tonight, how much it had actually cost her. Later, Doc pulled Dalia aside, away from the fire pit's noise and warmth. There are more people in this town who support you than you'd think, he said quietly. They're just scared to say so out loud, most of them. Scared of what? Of being different themselves. Of standing out. He studied her face in the dim light. Of being next. What if it doesn't get better? Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. What if this hostility just keeps getting worse from here? Doc smiled, tired but certain of himself. Then you'll handle it. You're stronger than you know, Dalia. Always were, even before you knew it yourself. Weeks folded into each other after that. The legal threats Grayson had promised never fully materialized, because the tribal claim held real legal weight behind it, and because enough quiet pressure, from within Millhaven's own ranks discouraged anyone from pushing much harder. Small towns had a way of policing their own reputations once enough neighbors got embarrassed together in the same room. Silas's furniture business began taking off almost overnight. Word of his craftsmanship traveled fast, through the region's wealthier towns, orders arriving faster than a two-man operation could reasonably fill. Dalia handled the paperwork, the invoicing, the customer calls, a natural fit for a mind that had always been good with numbers and had never, before, been given anything worth applying that skill to. Their first major commission came from a rancher outside Bozeman, a man standing 6'6" himself, sick to death of furniture that never quite fit his frame properly. The dining set Silas built him got photographed for a regional magazine, and the orders that followed very nearly buried them both in work. "Seems like there's more of us out there than anybody ever realized," Dalia said one evening, sorting through a growing stack of commission requests at the kitchen table Silas had built specifically, so her knees would never hit the underside of it. "Market demand." Silas grinned, rare and warm. "Maybe we build a whole business around people who don't fit the standard sizes anybody else bothers building for." The idea took root faster than either of them expected it to. Within a handful of months, orders were arriving from across 3 states. Silas hired 2 young men off the reservation, who needed steady work, and Dalia found herself learning shipping logistics and vendor contracts on the fly, teaching herself late at night, with a lamp burning long after Silas had already gone to sleep beside her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving somewhere. She was building something that actually mattered, in a place that had finally started, slowly, grudgingly, to make room for her existence. The fire started a little after midnight. Dalia woke to the smell first. Sharp. Wrong. Her body understood, before her brain had even caught up, some old animal instinct dragging her upright out of a dead sleep. "Silas." Her voice cracked out of her, before she'd even processed why. "Silas, wake up." He was already moving. Already at the window, already swearing low, and vicious in a way she'd never once heard from him in all these months. Because the workshop, their workshop, the one holding 6 months of built inventory, of half-finished commissions, of tools that had belonged to his father, and his father, before that, was burning. Orange light climbing against the dark tree line. Smoke rolling up thick and black into a sky that didn't have a single star left visible anymore. They ran. Both of them, barefoot across gravel that tore at their feet, and neither of them felt a single bit of it, not really, not with adrenaline flooding every other sensation out entirely. By the time they reached it, the fire had already claimed the roof. Heat rolling off it in waves strong enough to push them both back a full 10 feet, before either of them could even try getting closer. "The tools," Silas's voice broke on the word. Actually broke, this enormous, steady man, undone in half a second by watching his father's chisels burn to nothing. "We can't." Dalia grabbed his arm, hard, holding him back from a doorway that would have killed him outright if he'd gone through it. "Silas. We can't. It's gone." They stood there. Together. Watching 6 months of work, 6 months of proof that this mountain could hold something good, collapse slowly into embers in front of them. The fire department arrived 40 minutes later. Too late to do anything but confirm what both of them already knew standing there in the dark. By the time the sun came up, there was nothing left of the workshop but a blackened foundation, and the smell of scorched cedar hanging over the whole property like a curse that refused to lift on its own. "Arson," the fire chief said, crouching near what used to be the northeast corner. "Accelerant used here. And here. He pointed to two separate points along the collapsed frame. Somebody wanted this to burn fast. And burn complete. Dalia felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing whatsoever to do with the pre-dawn air around them. Because this wasn't an accident. Because somebody had walked onto this property in the dark, poured fuel across everything Silas had built with his own two hands, and lit a match without a second thought about it. And she had a sick, sinking feeling she already knew exactly who wanted this badly enough to actually do it. The sheriff's department pulled security footage from the county road camera 2 days later, grainy, low resolution, barely more than shapes moving through darkness. But one shape, caught for 11 seconds near the edge of the property line around 11:40 that night, matched close enough to a build the whole town recognized on sight, without much trouble. Cole Grayson. The rumor moved through Millhaven faster than the fire itself had. By the following afternoon, half the town had already convicted him in conversation, the other half already defending him just as loudly, and the sheriff found himself caught in the exact kind of political crossfire that made small-town law enforcement miserable work on a good day. Cole denied everything. Said he'd been out driving, nothing more, no reason he could possibly have to burn down a stranger's workshop over a wedding slight. Except Dalia sat, with that footage running through her head for 2 full days, something nagging at her that she couldn't quite name at first. Because something about the timeline didn't sit right in her gut. Something about the shape moving on, that grainy footage, the way it walked, the way it carried itself across that dark clearing. She'd worked retail for 3 years. Learned to read people, from clear across a store floor, who was about to steal something, who was about to complain, who was simply lost, and needed pointing toward the paint aisle. And something about Cole Grayson's walk, drunk and belligerent, as he'd been at that wedding just weeks earlier, didn't match the controlled, purposeful movement she was watching on that security footage. Which meant either she was wrong about it entirely, or somebody else had been up on that mountain that night, wearing Cole's build like a borrowed coat that didn't quite fit right. She started digging the only way she actually knew how, the way 3 years of bookkeeping had trained into her hands long before she'd ever met Silas. Numbers. Records. Paper trails that didn't lie, even when the people attached to them absolutely did. She pulled the county's public purchase records first. Nothing illegal about looking, small-town records offices ran on the assumption that nobody ever actually checked, which made them considerably easier to search than anybody expected going in. 3 days of quiet, careful searching. Evenings after the day's work was done, Silas asleep beside her, laptop glow the only light in the room, while she cross-referenced fuel purchases against dates, against names, against anything at all that might connect a bought can of accelerant to a burned workshop on a mountain that used to hold their entire future together. Until she found it. A receipt. Dated the afternoon before the fire. 5 gallons of accelerant, purchased in cash at a supply store 2 counties over, far enough that nobody local would think to check it, close enough that somebody in a hurry could make the round trip and be back well before midnight. The purchase was logged under a business account. Simmons Hardware. Dalia sat very still in the lamplight, staring at that name, until the letters stopped making sense as words and started just looking like shapes on a screen in front of her. Walt Simmons. The man who'd hired her when nobody else would even grant her an interview. Who'd modified her apartment ceilings out of simple decency, without her ever once having to ask. Who'd called her disappointing to her face, and then couldn't look her in the eye while doing it. She thought about that conversation in the store. Men like that don't do things without expecting something in return. She'd assumed it was ordinary small-town prejudice talking, ugly but essentially harmless. Except now she was staring at a receipt that said otherwise. Because either Walt had bought 5 gallons of accelerant for some entirely innocent reason that happened to line up, coincidentally, with the exact night somebody torched their workshop to the ground. Or Walt Simmons, the closest thing to a decent man this town had ever given her, had done something considerably worse than simply disapprove of her choices. Her hands were shaking by the time she closed the laptop. Not from fear, exactly. Something colder than fear. Something that felt a great deal more like betrayal, settling deep into her chest, and refusing to leave her alone with it. Because if Walt had done this, if Walt had actually walked that property line, with a gas can in his hand, and never once looked back, then somebody had gotten to him first. Somebody with enough leverage over a 56-year-old hardware store owner to make him risk prison, risk everything he'd spent his whole life building, just to burn down a stranger's workshop, over a piece of mountain neither of them technically owned according to the law, that mattered most in the end. And she had a very good, very sick idea of exactly whose name belonged at the top of that particular chain. She didn't wake Silas that night. Told herself it could wait until morning, until she had more than a receipt and a bad feeling to bring him. Except she lay there in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling he'd built high enough that she'd never once had to duck beneath it, and thought about Russell Grayson's voice drifting across the wind that afternoon in the equipment shed. That file from 62 needs to disappear. 2 threads. 2 secrets this town had been trying very hard to bury. And Dalia was starting to understand, lying awake while the man she loved slept beside her, entirely unaware of what she'd just found sitting on that screen, that those 2 threads weren't separate at all. They were the same rope. And somebody in Millhaven was pulling it a great deal harder than anybody up here on this mountain had realized. Yet, the morning after the receipt, Dalia didn't say anything to Silas over coffee. Couldn't, not right away. Because how do you tell a man the fire that took his father's tools might trace back to somebody he still, somewhere underneath all the anger, wanted to believe was decent? She waited until he'd finished his second cup. Until his shoulders had dropped an inch, the way they always did once caffeine finally caught up with grief. Then she slid the laptop across the table. "I found something," she said. "Last night." He read it twice. She watched his jaw work, watched something harden behind his eyes, that she'd only seen sit there once, before, that night in the diner parking lot, though it felt like years ago in her memory already. "Walt," he said. Flat. Like the name itself tasted wrong in his mouth. "Maybe." She made herself say it slow. "Careful. Or maybe somebody used his name. His account. I don't know yet, not for certain." "You believe that?" She didn't answer right away. Because the honest answer was no, not really, but some stubborn part of her still wanted to leave Walt Simmons a door he could walk back through, if he actually chose to. "I believe," she said finally, "that Walt didn't do this alone. Even if his hands lit the match itself." Silas was quiet a long moment, staring at the screen like it might rearrange itself into something considerably less painful, if he just looked hard enough at it. "Grayson," he said. "Grayson." They drove to Victor Saltwood's place, that same afternoon. Small house at the edge of the reservation, tidy, wood stove already going despite the mild weather, because Victor's bones, he liked to say, had stopped trusting spring somewhere around the same year Nixon resigned. Victor read the receipt. "Read it again." Set it down on the kitchen table like it weighed considerably more than paper had any business weighing. "This connects to something," he said slowly, "I've been chasing longer than you've been alive, young lady." "What do you mean?" Victor got up. Moved to a cabinet in the corner, the kind of cabinet that had clearly held the same contents for decades, without anyone daring to reorganize a single item inside it. He came back with a folder. Thin. Water-stained at one corner. The paper inside yellowed to the color of old teeth. 1962, he said, laying it open on the table between them. "Land survey. This parcel. The one your workshop sat on." He tapped a signature at the bottom of the page. "Supposed to belong to the tribe by federal recognition." Somehow, on paper, it doesn't anymore. Somehow the signature transferring it away belongs to a man who'd been dead 11 months by the date typed right there on this document. Dalia felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her chair. Whose signature, she said. Though some cold, sinking part of her already suspected the answer waiting for her. Earl Grayson. Victor's voice went flat. Russell's father. Was mayor here, before him, for over 2 decades. Ran this town like it belonged to him personally, and mostly it did. He closed the folder gently, like it might crumble, if handled wrong. I've had this file since 1987. Never had enough to move on it properly. Wasn't until now, somebody finally handed me a reason worth the fight all over again. Why now? Silas asked. Why didn't you push this before, all those years? Victor looked at him a long moment. Tired eyes. Eyes that had watched a great many promises get broken across a great many decades of waiting. Because fighting City Hall on principle alone gets you nowhere in this country, he said. Fighting them on a felony. That gets you somewhere worth going. The felony took shape, over the following 2 weeks. Because paper trails, once you start pulling on them, rarely stop at just one single thread. Dalia spent her evenings back at that laptop, Silas beside her now instead of asleep, both of them cross-referencing county records, with a lawyer Victor brought in, from Cheyenne, a sharp, quiet woman named Priya Okafor, who specialized in exactly this kind of tribal land dispute, and looked, Dalia thought, like she hadn't lost a case in a very long time indeed. The forgery alone, Priya said, spreading documents across the kitchen table one evening, gets us the land back. Clean. That part's almost easy, honestly. She looked up. The arson is what makes this dangerous for Grayson personally. If we can prove Russell knew about the 62 forgery, and used intimidation to cover it up, that's obstruction. That's conspiracy. That's a man who doesn't get to keep his office, let alone stay out of a courtroom entirely. And Walt? Dalia asked. Priya's expression softened, just slightly. Depends what he says. Willingly, or under subpoena. Those are 2 very different men, legally speaking, come the hearing. Walt came to them first. Nobody expected it. Least of all Dalia, standing at the sink 2 nights, before the county hearing, when headlights swept across the kitchen window, and her stomach dropped straight, through the floor, because for one wild second she thought, fire again, somebody again, this mountain wasn't done taking things from them just yet. Except it was just Walt's old truck. Idling at the edge of the property like the man behind the wheel couldn't quite decide whether he actually had the nerve to finish the drive up. He finally did. Climbed out slow. Older, somehow, than he'd looked 3 weeks ago. Like guilt aged a person faster than actual years ever managed to. Silas met him on the porch steps. Didn't invite him up. Didn't need to. I didn't come to ask forgiveness, Walt said, voice rough. Don't expect it. Don't deserve it. He looked past Silas, found Dalia standing in the doorway behind him. Came because I can't sleep. Haven't slept right in 3 weeks now. Then talk, Silas said. Flat. No mercy in it yet, not this early. Walt's hands were shaking. Actually shaking, this man who'd measured out lumber, with a steady hand for 30 straight years, without ever missing a cut. Grayson came to me the week after your engagement, he said. Told me he needed a favor. Said if I didn't help, he'd pull my business license inside a month. Said the county inspector owed him enough favors to make my whole operation disappear entirely. A breath, ragged. I've got a wife with a heart condition. Medical bills that'd bury us both, if that store closed down. I told myself it was just a scare tactic. Just smoke, nothing that'd actually catch and spread. You bought accelerant, Dalia said quietly. That's not smoke, Walt. That's a plan somebody thought through. I know what I did. His voice cracked clean in half. I know exactly what I did. I stood there, and watched that workshop light up, and I have not been right since. Not for one single hour of any day since. Silence stretched long between the three of them. Somewhere down the mountain, an owl called out, into the dark, indifferent to every bit of it. There's a hearing, Silas said finally. 2 days from now. County building. You could keep hiding behind Grayson's threats. A pause, waited. Or you could stop being a coward about all of this. Walt flinched like he'd been struck across the face. But he didn't argue. Didn't defend himself the way Dalia had half expected him to. I'll be there, he said. Whatever it ends up costing me. Cole found Dalia alone 2 days, before that, at the county records office, of all places on earth, the last spot she ever expected to run, into Russell Grayson's own son. She'd gone to pull one final document, a corroborating deed reference Priya needed, before the hearing convened. Cole was already there when she walked in. Sitting in the corner, hunched over a stack of papers, that didn't look like they belonged to him at all. He looked up. And something in his face had changed, since that wedding night weeks earlier. The bravado gone entirely. Replaced by something considerably closer to exhaustion. Didn't set that fire, he said. No preamble at all. Like he'd been rehearsing the line for days, and simply couldn't hold it in 1 second longer. The footage. I know what the footage shows. He cut her off, voice low, urgent. I was up there that night. Parked near the property line, watching. But I wasn't the one who lit anything. He swallowed hard. I was up there, because I followed my father's truck. Because he's been acting strange for weeks, and I wanted to know why, finally. Dalia stood very still. What did you see? Saw him meet Walt at the tree line. Handed him something. Didn't see what, not clearly, not from where I was parked. Left before whatever happened, happened. Didn't know what any of it meant, until the workshop burned the next morning, and my father acted like it was the best news he'd heard all year long. Cole's jaw tightened. I've spent 3 weeks trying to figure out what to do, with what I saw. Whether to say anything at all to anybody. And now? He pushed the stack of papers toward her. Photocopies. Bank statements. A withdrawal, cash, the week before the fire, made from an account Dalia recognized instantly, as belonging to Russell Grayson personally, not the town's coffers at all. Now I'm done protecting him, Cole said. Quiet. Something almost like grief underneath the words. He's my father. That doesn't mean I have to burn along with him. Dalia looked at the papers. Looked at Cole, 23 years old, raised his whole life inside a name, that apparently came, with rot sitting at the very root of it, and she felt something shift in her chest, that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't quite anger either, somewhere caught between the two. Why give this to me, she asked. Why not the sheriff directly? Because you'll actually use it right. A ghost of something, that might have been a smile, gone as fast, as it arrived. And because you slapped me across the face once, and I still think, honestly, I had it coming. The county hearing was held in the same community center, where Silas had first faced down a hostile town months earlier. Except this time, the room didn't hold the same energy at all. This time, folding chairs filled slower. Quieter. People shuffling in like they already suspected the ground under this whole town was about to shift, and none of them were entirely sure, yet which side they'd land on, when it finally did. Dalia sat at the front table beside Priya Okafor, beside Victor Saltwood, beside Silas whose hand found hers under the table, and didn't let go for the better part of 2 hours. Russell Grayson sat across the aisle. Flanked by a lawyer, who looked considerably less confident than the mayor's posture suggested he ought to feel. The county judge, a woman named Harriet Okonkwo Reyes, brought in from the district court, because local judges recused themselves the moment a sitting mayor's name got attached to a felony inquiry, called the room to order. "We're here," she said, "to review evidence regarding a 1962 land transfer, and its connection to a subsequent act of arson committed on the disputed property this past month. I want to be very clear, before we begin. This is not a trial. This is a hearing to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed to formal charges." Her eyes moved across the room, steady, unhurried. "Miss Okafor. You may proceed." Priya stood. Laid the 1962 survey up on the projector screen, the forged signature blown up large enough, that even the back row could see the date discrepancy plain, as daylight itself. "Earl Grayson," she said, "signed this transfer document 11 months, after his own death certificate was filed, with this exact same county office." A pause, letting the room fully absorb it. "The land in question was never legally ceded. It belongs, and has always belonged, to the Apache Nation under federal treaty protections, that predate this entire town." Murmurs. Loud enough that Judge Okonkwo-Reyes had to call for quiet twice in a row. "This forgery," Priya continued, "was discovered independently by Mr. Saltwood in 1987. Buried, for lack of resources to pursue it properly, until 3 weeks ago." She turned to the next exhibit. "When it became relevant again. Because the current mayor of this town appears to have gone to considerable lengths to keep it buried, where it was." She called Walt. He walked to the small witness table like a man walking toward his own sentencing. Which, in a way, he essentially was. "Mr. Simmons," Priya said gently. Gentler than Dalia had actually expected from her. "Can you tell the court what happened the week of the fire?" Walt's hands gripped the edge of the table. White-knuckled. "Mayor Grayson came to my store," he said. Voice unsteady. "Told me he needed the workshop gone. Said if that land survey ever came to light, while Tolman's operation was still standing on the property, it'd destroy him politically. Financially. Whatever it took to protect his family's name, no matter the cost to anyone else." "And what did he offer you?" Priya asked. "Or threaten you with, specifically?" "Both." Walt's voice cracked. "Said he'd pull my business license, through the inspector's office inside a month. Said my wife's medical bills would bury us, before the license issue even finished playing out in the courts." A long breath, shaking visibly now. "I bought the accelerant myself. I'm the one who lit it. Nobody forced my hand onto that match. I want that on the record clear, as anything else said here today." The room had gone dead silent. Even Grayson's own lawyer had stopped writing on his legal pad. "But you didn't act alone," Priya pressed. "In terms of motive behind it." "No." Walt looked up, finally, and found Dalia's eyes across the room. "Grayson knew exactly what he was asking me to do. And exactly why he needed it done." Grayson's lawyer rose immediately. "Objection, this is speculation about my client's intent." "Sit down, counsel," Judge Okonkwo-Reyes said, without raising her voice a single degree. "We'll get to intent shortly enough." They did. Priya called her next exhibit, and the room's temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees all at once. The bank statement. Cash withdrawal, the week before the fire, from Russell Grayson's personal account. Matched, dollar for dollar, against the exact cost of 5 gallons of industrial accelerant purchased 2 counties over. "Where did this documentation originate?" the judge asked. Priya glanced toward the back of the room. "From a witness, who wishes to speak for himself, Your Honor." Every head turned at once. Cole Grayson stood. Walked to the front of the room past his own father, who had gone the color of old paper by now, past a room full of people who'd known him his whole life, and had never once seen him look quite this exposed in front of any of them. "I followed my father the night of the fire," Cole said. Voice unsteady but not stopping for anything. Saw him meet Walt Simmons at the tree line. Didn't understand what I was watching, until the next morning came around. He swallowed hard. I've spent 3 weeks deciding whether loyalty to my father matters more than telling the plain truth. His eyes found Dalia's for one brief second across the room. It doesn't. Not anymore, not after all this. Grayson was on his feet now, face contorted, something caught between rage and pure panic. This is my son. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Sit down, mister. Grayson, the judge said, flat and final, or I will have you removed from this room entirely. He sat. Slowly. Like the full weight of the whole county had finally landed square on his shoulders all at once. The hearing ran another 2 hours. Because these things, in Dalia's limited experience of them, never resolved themselves in the tidy, cinematic way you might expect walking in. There was more testimony. More documents entered. A tense cross-examination, where Grayson's lawyer tried, unsuccessfully, to paint Walt's confession as coerced by Silas's family, an argument that collapsed entirely the moment Judge Okonkwo-Reyes asked, dryly, whether the lawyer was seriously suggesting a documented felony confession could be coached out of a 56-year-old business owner simply by standing near him in a room. But by the time the gavel finally came down, the outcome wasn't in doubt for anybody sitting in that room, on either side of the aisle. Based on the evidence presented today, Judge Okonkwo-Reyes said, this court finds sufficient grounds to refer both matters, the 1962 land forgery, and the subsequent arson conspiracy, to the district attorney's office for formal charges. Her eyes moved to Grayson, steady and unblinking. Mr. Grayson, I'd strongly advise retaining separate counsel from your current attorney, given the direction this is very clearly headed from here. She turned next to the matter of the land itself, sitting at the heart of everything. Pending final resolution of the criminal proceedings, she continued, this court is issuing an immediate injunction restoring the disputed parcel to tribal ownership, consistent with the treaty documentation submitted by Mr. Saltwood. Effective today, as of this hearing. Victor didn't smile. Didn't celebrate the moment out loud. Just closed his eyes for one long moment, like a man finally setting down something he'd been carrying since 1987 without complaint, and Dalia understood, watching him sit there, that some victories arrive too late to feel entirely like victories at all. They just feel like relief, mostly. Which sometimes has to be enough to carry a person forward. Grayson lost his office, within the month that followed. Didn't wait for an actual recall vote to force the issue, resigned 2 weeks, after formal charges were filed against him, released a statement full of words like regret, and moving forward, that fooled absolutely nobody in Millhaven who'd sat in that community center, and watched his own son testify against him, with their own eyes. Cole didn't speak to his father again that summer. Dalia heard, secondhand, through Doc Whitfield, that Cole had moved out to Cheyenne, taken a job at a feed store, was trying, slowly, imperfectly, 1 week at a time, to build something for himself, that didn't have his father's name stitched into the foundation of it anywhere. She didn't know if that counted as redemption exactly. Didn't know if it was even her place to decide that for somebody else's life. But she thought about the receipt he'd handed her at the records office, thought about a young man choosing truth over blood in a room full of people who'd have understood completely if he'd chosen otherwise, and she found she couldn't hold onto the anger anymore. Not the way she'd expected herself to. Walt pled guilty. Received probation, community service, a suspended sentence, that came bundled, with conditions, restitution to Silas for the workshop, mandatory hearings before the County Business Licensing Board, a formal public accounting of everything that had happened, laid bare for anyone who wanted to read it. He showed up at the mountain 3 days after his sentencing. Alone this time. No truck idling nervously at the edge of the property. I know sorry doesn't rebuild anything, he said, standing at the base of the porch steps like a man who understood he hadn't earned the right to climb them uninvited. But I'm saying it anyway. To both of you, together. Silas studied him a long moment. The kind of long moment that used to make people nervous, back before any of this happened, back when Silas Tolman was just a stranger too big for this town's comfort to hold. "You lied to my face," Silas said. "Quiet. Called this town's cruelty by a nicer name than it ever deserved. Then you burned down everything my father ever taught me, with your own 2 hands, and you did it, without a single warning." Walt didn't argue. Didn't try to soften any of it. "I did," he said. Silence stretched. Long enough that Dalia found herself holding her breath, without meaning to at all. "I'm not going to pretend that's forgiven," Silas said finally. "Not today. Maybe not for a long while yet, if I'm being honest with you." A pause. "But I know what it costs a man to stand at the bottom of a porch, and say what you just said out loud. That counts for something. Not everything. Something." Walt's eyes went wet. He nodded, once, and didn't push for more than what he'd already been given. Which, Dalia thought, was probably the single wisest thing he'd done throughout this entire ordeal. "There's a hardware order," Silas added, almost as an afterthought, "4 hinges. Specialized stock. Rebuilding the workshop's going to need supplies I can't easily source anywhere else in this county." Walt looked up. Something flickering behind his eyes, that looked almost like hope, cautious and entirely unearned, but present all the same, sitting there. "I can source that," he said. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it." "We'll see," Silas said. Not a yes. Not quite a no either. Just a door, left open the smallest crack in the world, for a man to slowly earn his way back, through it, if he genuinely had that in him. The workshop went up again, over the following 2 months. Different footprint this time, Silas insisted on it, said rebuilding the exact same structure felt too much like pretending the fire had never actually happened at all. This one sat 20 feet further back, from the tree line. Steel roofing instead of the old cedar shakes. A small detail on paper, but one that mattered to him in a way Dalia understood, without ever needing it fully explained out loud. The 2 young men, from the reservation came back to help, and so did Del, and so, on 3 separate weekends, did Cole, quiet, unannounced, showing up with work gloves, and asking for the hardest labor available, like physical exhaustion was the only penance he trusted himself to actually accept. Nobody made a speech about any of it. Nobody needed to. Silas just handed him a hammer the first morning, and said, "Start on the north wall," and that turned out to be, as close to absolution, as either one of them seemed to require, from the other. By late summer, the new workshop stood finished. Bigger than the old one had ever been. Sturdier, somehow, in a way, that had nothing to do with the steel, and everything to do with what it had actually survived to get built the second time around. Orders started arriving again almost immediately. Word had spread past the fire, past the hearing, past all of it, because people, it turned out, didn't just want handcrafted furniture anymore. They wanted furniture with a story attached to it. A story about a man who kept building even after somebody tried to burn his whole life down to ash around him. Dalia found out she was pregnant on an ordinary Tuesday in September, standing in the bathroom of the house Silas built, staring at a small plastic stick like it might change its answer, if she just looked hard enough at it. It didn't. She sat down on the edge of the tub. Because her legs, for the first time in longer than she could actually remember, didn't feel like they belonged to her at all in that moment. Because she'd spent years, actual years, convincing herself she'd never do this. Never bring a child, into a body built like hers, into a world that had spent 26 years making very clear exactly what it thought about people who didn't fit its measurements. Except she thought about every room in this house Silas had raised, with his own hands, board by board, out of nothing, but the simple insistence that somebody like her deserved a place to exist, without ever once apologizing for it. And she thought, this child whatever size it eventually grew into, tall or short, or somewhere ordinary in between, was going to grow up in a home built for exactly the purpose of never making anyone feel small standing inside it. She found Silas in the new workshop, sanding a table leg, sawdust catching gold in the late afternoon light slanting through the window behind him. He looked up. Read something in her face, before she'd said a single word out loud. Dalia. Just her name. Careful. Like he already suspected the answer, and didn't want to say it first in case he happened to be wrong. I'm pregnant, she said. The sander clattered out of his hand, onto the workbench. And for one long second, this enormous, steady man, a man who'd stared down an armed convoy of angry neighbors, without so much as flinching, looked completely undone standing there. Are you? He crossed the room in 2 strides. Stopped just short of touching her, like he needed permission first, before he trusted himself to. Are you sure? Sure enough. He pulled her into him then, careful the way he always was, like her size was something to be cherished instead of managed around. She felt him shaking slightly against her, felt the wet warmth against her hair, that told her, without either of them needing to say it out loud, exactly how much this meant to him. We're going to be terrible at this, she said, into his chest, half laughing, half crying at the same time. Neither of us has the faintest idea what we're doing. No, he agreed. But we'll figure it out. Together. The way we've figured out everything else that's come our way. Nora arrived the following weekend, before either of them had even managed to call her, because word apparently traveled fast in families like this one too, not just in towns built on gossip. She went very still when Silas told her. Still in a way, that worried Dalia for one flickering second, until she saw the old woman's eyes fill, saw her hand press flat against her own chest like she was steadying a heartbeat that had picked up too fast for comfort. A great-grandchild, Nora said, voice thick with it. I did not think I would live to see this day arrive. You've got years left in you, yet, Silas said, gruff, trying and failing to keep his own voice steady on the words. Nora reached out. Took Dalia's hand in both of hers, small and weathered, and impossibly strong despite everything. This child, she said, will grow up knowing exactly what it means to belong somewhere fully. That is not nothing, granddaughter. That is everything most people spend their whole lives chasing, and never once manage to find. They held the ceremony in late October, time to fall on the same afternoon Nora had already planned to bring something else up the mountain, something she'd been quietly working on for weeks, without either of them knowing. Small. Quiet. Nothing at all like the chaos that had crashed their wedding months earlier, just family this time, gathered on the porch of the house, as the last of the autumn light turned the whole valley gold below them. Nora brought the original wedding quilt first, the one size generously for 2 very tall people to share beneath. Laid it across Dalia's lap like she'd done once before, months back, on a night that had ended in headlights and hostility instead of peace. Then she brought out something else. Smaller. Folded with that same careful reverence she gave to everything that mattered. A second blanket. Woven in a pattern Dalia recognized as a smaller echo of the first, clearly made by the same hands, clearly made with the same intention, though considerably more recently than the original had been. I started this the week you told me you were expecting, Nora said, pressing it gently into Dalia's arms. Every family needs more than one generation wrapped in the same love. This is how we make certain that love never skips a single one of them. Dalia held the small blanket against her still flat stomach, throat too tight to manage words for a long moment. Thank you, she finally managed. For all of it. For seeing me, before anybody else in this whole world thought to bother looking. Nora's weathered face softened into something Dalia had rarely seen sitting there before, pure, unguarded joy, undisguised. You saw yourself, Nora said. Eventually. I only helped you get there a little faster than you would have alone. Victor and Ruth had come up for it too, and Dell, and even Doc Whitfield, leaning on a cane now, that he hadn't needed the spring before, insisting he wouldn't have missed this particular afternoon for anything the county could have offered him instead. Somewhere in the middle of it, glass raised, Doc cleared his throat for a toast nobody had asked him to give. In 70-some years in this town, he said, I've delivered more babies than I can rightly count anymore. But I don't believe I've ever looked forward to one quite the way I'm looking forward to this one right here. He nodded toward Dalia's stomach, eyes bright. Because this child is going to grow up in a house built by two people, who refused to believe the world had the final say on, where they belonged. That's not a bad inheritance to be born into. Not a bad inheritance at all. The porch went quiet, after that, in the good way, the kind of quiet that settles over people who don't need to fill every space with words. Once the small gathering had wound down, once Nora and Victor and Dell had all driven back down the mountain, once the last of the guests had said their goodbyes, and the fire pit had burned down to embers glowing soft against the coming dark, Dalia and Silas sat together on the porch steps. The same steps where he'd once knelt in sawdust and asked her to marry him. The same steps where, in a handful of years, they'd likely be teaching a child to take its very first steps of its own. Below them, Millhaven's lights flickered on one by one, as the valley slid slowly into evening. A town that had once tried to burn them clean off this mountain. A town slowly, imperfectly, learning to make room instead of taking it away. Do you ever wonder, Dalia asked quietly, what would have happened, if you'd never walked into that hardware store that morning? Silas considered it the way he considered most things that mattered to him. Slow. Serious. Unhurried by the question. I think we'd have found each other eventually, he said. Some things are built to happen, one way or another. Doesn't much matter how long the road takes to get there in the end. You really believe that? I believe, he said, taking her hand, calloused fingers wrapping careful and complete around hers, that when you're building something worth having, the right people show up exactly when you need them standing beside you. You were ready to be found. I was ready to do the finding, whenever it finally came. She leaned into him. Felt the solid, steady warmth of him beside her, the house at their back standing tall and wide and built entirely out of the simple belief that she deserved to take up space in this world, without ever once apologizing for the room she required. Above them, the first stars came out, over the valley. Distant. Indifferent to everything that had happened on this mountain, the fire, the hearing, the slow unraveling of a lie that had waited 60 years to finally be told out loud to a room full of people who needed to hear it. But close enough, still, to watch two people finally arrive at the ending that had been waiting patiently for them the entire time, all along. Not because the world had ever made it easy on either of them. Because they'd built it themselves. Beam by beam. Truth by truth. Until there was nothing left standing between them, and the life they'd both, quietly, stubbornly, refused to stop believing they deserved to have.